The wind had a voice on the plains, and it was a keening thing. A razor that stripped the warmth from a man's bones and left nothing but the hard truth of his own mortality. Eli knew that voice better than any other. It had been his companion for more years than he cared to count, singing him to sleep under star-dusted skies and waking him with a frozen kiss in the gray light of dawn. But this was different. This wind carried teeth. It carried the scent of deep ice and the promise of a blizzard that would bury the world in white silence. And for the first time in a long while, Eli was without a horse. 3 days ago, he'd had Bess, a steady roan mare with a gentle eye and a spirit as tough as prairie grass. He'd had a saddle, a good Winchester, and a pouch with enough coin to see him through another month. Now, all he had was the taste of rust and blood in his mouth from where 2 half-starved drifters had laid him low outside of Willow Creek. They'd taken everything but the worn clothes on his back and the ghosts in his eyes. So he walked. He walked with the methodical, ground-eating stride of a man who knows that to stop is to die. The vast, undulating sea of brown grass, brittle with frost, stretched to every horizon. The sky was a sheet of lead, pressing down, heavy and suffocating. Each gust of wind was a physical blow, forcing its way through the seams of his thin coat, a coat that had seen too many seasons and offered little more than a memory of warmth. Hunger was a dull, persistent ache in his gut, a familiar companion he'd learned to ignore. But the cold was a more insidious enemy. It leached the strength from his limbs, turned his thoughts sluggish, and whispered tempting lies about the comfort of simply lying down, just for a moment, in the soft, welcoming snow that was beginning to fall. He'd been following the ghost of a wagon trail, 2 faint ruts in the earth that suggested civilization, or at least its memory, lay somewhere ahead. Hope was a dangerous luxury, a fire that could burn a man out from the inside, but it was all he had left to chew on. He pulled his hat down low, the brim stiff with ice, and hunched his shoulders against the onslaught. His world had shrunk to the next step, and the one after that. The rhythmic crunch of his boots on the hardening ground was the only sound besides the wind's mournful song. Just as the gray afternoon began to bleed into a deeper, more threatening twilight, he saw it. At first, it was just a smudge on the horizon, a collection of low, dark shapes that could have been a trick of the fading light. But as he drew closer, the shapes resolved into buildings, a town, or what was left of one. It wasn't much. A single, muddy street flanked by a dozen or so buildings, their wooden facades weathered to the color of bone, a sagging general store, a livery with a caved-in roof, a saloon with one of its bat-wing doors hanging from a single hinge, and a handful of houses that seemed to be leaning on each other for support against the relentless wind. The place had the look of something that had given up, that was slowly being reclaimed by the vast, empty land around it. Smoke, thin and pale, curled from only 2 or 3 chimneys, a fragile sign of life in the growing gloom. He thought he saw a name on a faded sign hanging above the general store, Stone Creek. It sounded as hard and unforgiving as the land itself. As Eli limped onto the main street, the few souls who were out and about froze. A man sweeping the porch of the store stopped, his broom held mid-air, his face a mask of suspicion. A curtain twitched in the window of a small house. 2 men hunkered by the wall of the defunct blacksmith shop fell silent, their eyes tracking him, cold and flat. Eli was used to being watched. A man who lives on the trail learns to read the silent language of stairs. He was a stranger, and a stranger was a threat, a question mark, a harbinger of trouble. He was tall and lean, his face all hard angles and shadowed planes, darkened by sun and wind, and etched with lines that spoke of hard miles and harder choices. He hadn't seen his own reflection in weeks, but he knew what they saw. A drifter, 1 step away from an outlaw, his poverty as plain as the dirt on his face. He ignored them, his gaze fixed on the saloon. Even if it was barely functioning, there might be a fire, a chance to buy a measure of whiskey with the single, solitary silver dollar he'd kept hidden in the sole of his boot. It was his last resort. the coin that stood between him and utter destitution. It was then that he saw her. She was coming from the direction of the general store, head bowed against the wind, her body straining as she wrestled a heavy burlap sack. A faded wool shawl was pulled tight around her head and shoulders, but strands of dark hair had escaped, whipping across her face. The wind tore at her skirts and threatened to steal the sack from her grasp. She was a small woman, but there was a stubborn set to her shoulders, a refusal to be beaten by the elements or the burden she carried. She was 20 feet from him when a particularly vicious gust of wind caught the sack, pulling her off balance. She stumbled, one hand flying out to steady herself against the wall of the store. The sack, filled with firewood, slipped from her other hand and fell into the muddy, half-frozen street with a dull thud. A small, defeated sigh escaped her lips, visible as a plume of white in the frigid air. The men by the blacksmith shop watched, motionless. The storekeeper had already turned and gone back inside. No one moved to help. It was as if she were as invisible as he was. Another piece of the town's bleak scenery. Eli didn't think. He simply moved. In 3 long strides, he was beside her. He bent down, his cold, numbed fingers closing around the rough burlap. The sack was heavy, filled with thick, dense logs that would burn slow and hot. He hefted it easily onto his shoulder, the weight a familiar comfort. The woman straightened up, startled, her hand flying to her throat. He got his first proper look at her then. She was younger than he'd first thought, perhaps in her mid-20s. Her face was pale and thin, with high cheekbones and a wide mouth. But it was her eyes that held him. They were a deep, clear gray, the color of the sky before a storm, and they were filled with a weariness that went far beyond her years. And in their depths, there was a flicker of fear, quickly followed by a cautious curiosity. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was a low rasp, rusty from disuse. She just stared at him, her lips parted slightly. She seemed to be holding her breath. She took in his ragged coat, the dark stubble on his jaw, the raw cold burn on his cheeks. He knew he was a fearsome sight. He expected her to recoil, to thank him curtly and snatch the sack away. He shifted the weight on his shoulder. "Where to?" She seemed to find her voice, though it was little more than a whisper against the wind. "The edge of town, the last house." She pointed with a chin that trembled slightly, whether from cold or fear. He couldn't tell. Without another word, he started walking. He could feel her falling into step just behind him, her presence a strange, unnerving warmth at his back. He could feel the eyes of the town on them both now, the silent judgment doubling, weaving them together in a shared condemnation. The stranger and the woman who would accept his help. The house was small, little more than a cabin, set back from the road and looking as if it had grown from the frozen earth itself. The wood was silvered with age, the roof patched in several places. A curl of smoke, braver than the others in town, rose from its stone chimney. A dilapidated barn, its north wall collapsed inward, sagged nearby. It was a place that clung to life by a thread. He followed her to the small, covered porch and set the sack of firewood down by the door. He turned to leave without a word. His part was done. The saloon and its fire were waiting. "Wait," she said, her voice a little stronger now. He stopped, his back still to her. "The snow, it's getting worse. You can't travel in this." He half turned, his gaze sweeping over the landscape. She was right. The flakes were coming down thick and fast now, no longer dancing but driving, a white curtain that was steadily erasing the world. The wind howled, piling drifts against the side of the house. "I'll manage," he said, the words clipped. "No," she said, and there was a note of quiet authority in her voice that surprised him. "You won't." She paused, and he could feel her wrestling with her next words. You can stay the night by the fire. It's not much, but it's warm." Eli turned fully to face her then. His eyes narrowed. He searched her face for a trick, for a price. Kindness without a motive was a language he no longer spoke, but he saw none. He saw only a genuine, if hesitant, concern in those storm-gray eyes. He also saw the shadow of judgment from the town reflected there, the knowledge of what she was risking by making this offer. Before he could answer, the cabin door opened a crack. A small face, framed by a thatch of sandy brown hair, peered out. A boy, no older than 6, with his mother's serious gray eyes. He stared at Eli with a child's unfiltered suspicion before darting back inside and pulling the door shut. The sight of the boy decided it. Whatever danger this woman represented, it was nothing compared to the certainty of the blizzard. To refuse would be a fool's pride, and Eli had shed most of his pride miles ago, along with his horse and his Winchester. He gave a single, curt nod. "Obliged, ma'am." Her shoulders seemed to relax, a tension he hadn't noticed until it was gone. "My name is Miriam," she said softly, "and that's Caleb." "Eli," he replied. She opened the door and stepped inside, holding it for him. He hesitated for a fraction of a second on the threshold before ducking his head and following her into the warmth. The inside of the cabin was one small room, but it was clean and, compared to the howling fury outside, blessedly warm. A fire crackled in a large stone hearth, casting a flickering, golden light on the simple wooden furniture. A small table with 2 chairs stood in the center of the room. A bed was tucked into one corner, and a smaller cot was pushed against the opposite wall. The air smelled of pine smoke, boiling potatoes, and something else. Something clean, like soap and dried lavender. It was the scent of a home, and it was so foreign to him that it made his chest ache. The boy, Caleb, stood by his mother's skirts, his thumb in his mouth, his eyes wide as he watched Eli shed his snow-caked hat. Miriam gently nudged him forward. "This is Mr. Eli, Caleb. He's going to stay out of the storm with us tonight." Caleb said nothing, just continued to stare. Miriam gestured towards the fire. "Please, warm yourself. I'm making a stew. There's enough for 3. Eli moved towards the hearth, drawn by its heat like a moth to a flame. He held his hands out, the feeling slowly, painfully returning to his fingers in a wave of pins and needles. He listened to the quiet sounds of the cabin, the bubble of the pot over the fire, the soft scuff of Miriam's shoes on the wooden floorboards, the almost silent breathing of the boy who was still watching his every move. It was a world away from the howling wind outside. They ate in near silence at the small table. The stew was thin, mostly potatoes and a few bits of salted pork. But to Eli, it was the finest meal he'd had in months. It was hot and filling, and it chased the deepest chill from his bones. Miriam ate little, pushing most of her portion towards Caleb, who ate with the solemn focus of a small child. Eli tried not to watch her, but his eyes were drawn to the efficient way she moved, the quiet grace in her hands as she broke a piece of bread for her son. There was a deep-seated weariness about her, but also a resilience as strong and supple as a willow branch. When the meal was done, she cleared the plates. Eli remained at the table, unsure of the protocol. In his world, a meal was followed by a departure, but the blizzard was now a solid wall of white against the single window pane. "You can take the blankets by the hearth," Miriam said, not looking at him as she washed the bowls in a basin. "I'm sorry it's not a proper bed." "It's more than enough," he said, his voice still a gravelly rasp. She put Caleb to bed on the small cot, tucking him in with a tenderness that made Eli look away, feeling like an intruder on a sacred ritual. Then she retreated to her own bed in the corner, pulling a privacy curtain made of patched-together flour sacks across the space. The cabin fell into a new kind of silence, punctuated by the crackle of the fire and the roar of the wind. Eli spread the 2 thin wool blankets on the worn rag rug before the hearth. The floor was hard, but the stone radiated a steady, penetrating warmth. He lay down, fully dressed save for his boots, and stared into the flames. He was a wolf invited into a sheepfold, A creature of the wild brought in from the cold. He knew he should be grateful. And he was. But underneath the gratitude was a profound unease. This quiet domesticity, this simple warmth, was a world he had long ago been cast out of. He lay awake for hours, listening. He heard the storm rage, rattling the door in its frame. He heard the fire hiss and pop. And through it all, from behind the curtain, he heard the soft sound of Miriam turning in her bed, the whisper of cotton on straw. It was an impossibly intimate sound, a reminder of the life, the closeness, that existed just a few feet away from him, a universe away from the cold, lonely ground that was his accustomed bed. He felt the familiar walls he'd built around himself, walls of silence and solitude, begin to feel thin and brittle in the warmth of this small, quiet room. The blizzard blew itself out by morning, leaving behind a world transformed, buried under a thick blanket of pristine, silent white. The sun rose into a cloudless sky, its light sharp and dazzling on the new snow. Eli was awake before dawn, his body accustomed to rising with the first hint of light. He folded the blankets neatly and placed them back on the chair, his movements quiet so as not to wake the cabin's other occupants. His intention was simple: to slip out before they woke, to leave as silently as he had arrived. A night's shelter was a debt he couldn't repay, and lingering would only complicate things. He pulled on his stiff, cold boots and was reaching for the door latch when her voice stopped him. "You're leaving." He turned. Miriam was sitting up in her bed. The curtain pulled aside. Her dark hair was loose around her shoulders, and in the soft morning light, with the sleep still in her eyes, she looked younger, more vulnerable. "Storms passed," he said, by way of explanation. "The drifts will be deep. The roads won't be clear for days." She swung her legs out of bed, pulling her shawl around her shoulders against the morning chill. "At least stay for some coffee?" He hesitated. The smell of coffee was already beginning to fill the air, a tempting, civilized aroma. He found himself nodding before he'd consciously decided to. As she moved about the cabin, stoking the fire and measuring out coffee grounds, her eyes kept drifting towards the collapsed barn, visible through the window. A heavy sigh escaped her. "The north wall finally gave way in the storm," she said, more to herself than to him. "I don't have the strength to shore it up myself, and no coin to pay anyone from town to do it." Eli looked out the window. The barn was in a sorry state, a vital structure for a homestead, however small. Without it, there was no place to shelter a milk cow or store hay for the winter. He looked at her, then at the sleeping boy, and an idea, practical and straightforward, took shape. It was a way to pay his debt. "I can fix it," he said. She turned from the stove, her eyes wide with surprise. I can't pay you." "Wasn't asking for pay," he said gruffly. He gestured vaguely around the room. "A few days' work, for the meal and the roof last night, and maybe a few more till the job's done." It was a transaction, labor for food and shelter, a language they both understood. It was clean, with no messy emotions or unspoken obligations. Miriam studied his face for a long moment, her gray eyes searching his. He met her gaze, his own expression unreadable. "Finally." She nodded slowly. "All right," she said. "That would be a great help. Thank you." And so the days began. They fell into a strange, unspoken rhythm. Each morning, Eli would rise early and head out into the biting cold. The work was hard. He salvaged what timber he could from the collapsed wall, his breath pluming in the frigid air. He chopped new posts from a small stand of pine at the edge of her property, the rhythmic thud of his axe the only sound in the snow-muffled landscape. His hands, long unaccustomed to such labor, were quickly raw and blistered, but he welcomed the clean, honest pain. It focused his mind, kept the ghosts at bay. He worked with a silent, relentless intensity. He spoke little, answering Miriam's questions with curt nods or single words. He took his meals at her table, the silence between them thick but no longer entirely uncomfortable. In the evenings, he would sit by the fire, cleaning the old tools he'd found in the barn or simply staring into the flames, lost in his own thoughts. He was aware of her constantly. He watched her from the corner of his eye as she moved through her daily chores, mending Caleb's worn trousers, kneading dough with flour dusting her forearms, reading to the boy in a low, soft voice. She was a creature of quiet strength and endless industry. Caleb remained wary of him. The boy would watch him from the cabin door, a small, silent sentinel. But his suspicion was slowly being eroded by a child's natural curiosity. Eli would sometimes find him standing at the edge of the barn, observing as Eli set a post or wrestled a heavy beam into place. Eli never acknowledged him directly, but he was aware of the boy's steady presence. At night, sleep came hard, lying on the floor by the dying embers of the fire, the cabin wrapped in a profound silence. Eli would listen. He would hear the soft sigh of the house settling, the distant howl of a lone coyote, and the quiet, rhythmic breathing from the other side of the room. He would hear Miriam shift in her sleep, the rustle of her blankets, a sound that burrowed deep into his consciousness. In these quiet, dark hours, the walls he had so carefully constructed around his heart felt thin. He was an observer of a life he could never have, a temporary guest in a world of warmth and quiet connection. The loneliness he carried was a cold, hard stone in his gut. But here, in this small cabin, a strange and gentle warmth was beginning to seep into its frozen edges. The air between him and the widow was still vast and empty, filled with unspoken pasts and uncertain futures. But it was no longer cold. A thaw had begun, slow and imperceptible, deep beneath the surface of the long winter silence. The silence of the first days gave way to a new kind of language, one spoken not with words but with shared space and quiet routine. The boy, Caleb, was the first to bridge the gap. He was a small, solemn moon orbiting the fixed, silent sun of his mother, but he found himself increasingly drawn into the gravitational pull of the stranger working at the edge of their small world. It began with a piece of rope. Eli was splicing a frayed tether he'd found, his large, calloused hands moving with an efficient, practiced grace. Caleb stood a few feet away, a small statue in a patched coat, his eyes fixed on the intricate dance of Eli's fingers. Eli didn't look up, didn't acknowledge the boy's presence for a long time. Then, without a word, he picked up a shorter length of rope, held it out, and with a few deft twists, formed a perfect bowline knot. He tugged it, showing its strength, then loosened it with a single, practiced pull. He laid the rope on a stump between them and went back to his work. Caleb hesitated for a full minute before inching forward. He picked up the rope. His small, clumsy fingers fumbled with the coarse fibers, trying to replicate the fluid motions he had witnessed. He failed, ending up with a tangled mess. He tried again, his brow furrowed in concentration. From the corner of his eye, Eli watched, when the boy's frustration was about to boil over into tears. Eli set down his own work, knelt on one knee in the snow, and said, his voice a low rumble, "Here, the rabbit comes out of the hole, goes around the tree, and back down the hole." He guided the boy's hands, his touch surprisingly gentle, until the knot was formed. He didn't smile, but a new light flickered in Caleb's eyes, the bright, sharp spark of understanding. From then on, the boy was his shadow. Eli taught him how to find dry kindling at the heart of a snow-laden pine, how to stack wood for a fire that would breathe and catch quickly, not choke on its own smoke. He showed him how to read the tracks of a rabbit in the snow and the difference between the call of a hawk and a jay. These were lessons in survival, the only catechism Eli truly knew, and he passed them on with a gravity that the boy instinctively respected. Sometimes, in the deep twilight, after the day's work was done and the cold was driving them all toward the hearth, Caleb would ask for a story. Eli's stories were not like the ones Miriam read from her worn-out book. They were spare, lean tales, told in that same low, gravelly voice. He spoke of a wild mustang that no man could break, a lone coyote that outsmarted a dozen traps, a vast, empty stretch of land where the sky was so big it could swallow a man whole. He never spoke of heroes or villains, only of endurance, of survival, of the relentless, unblinking realities of the wild. Caleb would listen, rapt, his chin in his hands, his gray eyes reflecting the firelight in the vast, lonely landscapes Eli painted with his simple words. Miriam watched it all from a distance. She watched from the cabin window as Eli showed her son how to hold an axe safely. She watched from the porch as they built a small, crude snare. And she listened, her hands still in the dishwater or the mending basket, as Eli's quiet voice filled the small cabin. A complex, painful emotion would tighten in her chest. It was a vision of a life she had never dared to imagine again. A man's low voice in the evening, a son looking up with open admiration, the simple, solid presence of a protector. It was a ghost of a family, and it hurt to look at it directly. She was deeply, profoundly moved, but she built a wall of quiet composure around the feeling, terrified that if she acknowledged it, it would vanish like smoke. The nights grew colder. The winter sank its teeth deep into the land, and the small cabin became their entire world. After Caleb was asleep, a new ritual formed. Miriam would bring out a stone jug filled with a clear, fiery liquor she distilled from potatoes. It was harsh and potent, meant not for pleasure but to fight the chill that seeped through the log walls. She would pour 2 small tin cups. They would sit on opposite sides of the hearth, the fire between them like a silent chaperone, and they would drink. In the warm, silent space, words came a little easier. They never spoke of the things that mattered most, but they began to trade small, worn pieces of their pasts, like travelers exchanging trinkets from faraway lands. "My husband, Thomas, he built this hearth," she said one night, her gaze lost in the flames. "He said a house isn't a home until it has a fire that can see you through a blizzard. He was a good man, strong. The woods, they just took him." She fell silent, the simple statement holding a world of loss. Another night, it was Eli who spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I spent a winter trapping near the Canadian border once. The silence, it gets inside you, becomes a part of your blood. A man can forget the sound of his own voice up there." He stared at the cup in his hands, as if seeing that vast, white landscape within it. They were mapping the edges of their loneliness, carefully avoiding the dark territories at the center. He learned she was from the east, had come west with Thomas full of hope for a timber claim that had yielded nothing but hardship and an early grave. She learned he'd been everywhere and belonged nowhere, that he'd punched cattle in Texas, mined for silver in Colorado, and drifted through territories whose names were just marks on a map to her. They were sharing their stories, but the most important pages were torn out. He never mentioned the man he'd killed, the reason he was always looking over his shoulder. And she never spoke of the desperate, dark choices she'd made to keep her son from starving in the months after Thomas's death. They were 2 people with locked rooms in their hearts, sitting together in the warmth, pretending they didn't hold the keys. The thaw, when it came, was violent and unexpected. It was a day of brutal, wind-driven cold. Eli was finishing the last of the repairs on the barn, while Miriam had decided to sort through the meager supplies in the small, unheated grain store adjacent to it. The store was little more than a shed, and the cold inside was a dead, breathless thing, far worse than the wind outside. Eli was driving a final wooden peg into a beam when he realized he hadn't seen her for over an hour. A sudden, sharp unease pricked at him. It was a feeling he knew well, the old instinct of the hunted, the sense that something was wrong. He dropped his mallet and strode to the grain store. The door was slightly ajar. He pushed it open and stepped inside. The air was frigid, thick with the dusty smell of old grain and frost. He saw her immediately. She was slumped on the floor against a stack of burlap sacks. Her head bowed. She wasn't moving. "Miriam?" His voice was sharp, cutting through the silence. There was no answer. In 2 strides, he was beside her, dropping to his knees. He touched her cheek. Her skin was like ice. Her lips had a bluish tinge. He grabbed her wrist, his fingers pressing hard, searching for a pulse. He found one, but it was faint and thready, like a moth beating against a window pane. Hypothermia. He'd seen it take men on the trail. A quiet, insidious thief of life. Panic, cold and sharp, seized him. He scooped her into his arms. She was terrifyingly light, as if the cold had already leached the substance from her. He kicked the door open and half ran, half stumbled through the snow to the cabin, his heart hammering against his ribs. He laid her on the rag rug before the hearth, his movements urgent and rough. Caleb, who had been playing with a carved wooden horse, scrambled back, his eyes wide with fear. "Get the blankets! Boy, all of them!" Eli commanded, his voice a harsh bark. He began piling wood onto the fire, his hands shaking slightly. He needed heat. Now, as Caleb dragged the blankets from the beds, Eli turned back to Miriam. Her outer coat and shawl were damp from where she'd been sitting on the frozen ground. They were stealing what little warmth she had left. Without a second thought, he began to unbutton her coat. His fingers fumbled with the small, cold buttons. He pulled the heavy, damp wool away. Underneath, her dress was also cold to the touch. He knew what he had to do. He had to get the cold, damp layers off her, get her skin next to the warmth of the fire and the blankets. He worked quickly, his focus absolute. He unfastened the tiny buttons at the collar of her simple cotton dress. He eased the damp fabric off her shoulders, his gaze clinical, detached. But then, as he pulled the dress away, his eyes fell upon the white, delicate skin of her collarbones, the gentle curve of her shoulder. He saw the faint blue veins beneath the skin, the utter, defenseless vulnerability of her, and his gaze lingered. In that moment, she was not the capable widow, the strong mother, the woman who kept a careful, polite distance. She was just Miriam, a fragile human warmth fighting against a vast, killing cold, a wave of something fierce and protective, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a decade, washed over him. It was a raw, painful, possessive feeling. He quickly wrapped her in the blankets, piling them high, chafing her icy hands and feet, trying to rub the life back into them. She woke slowly, as if surfacing from a deep, dark water. Her first sensation was of warmth, a deep, penetrating heat that seemed to be radiating from the hearth and from something else. Her eyelids fluttered open. The fire was a blurry, dancing gold. The room was dim. She felt a strong, steady pressure around her hand. She looked down. A large, calloused hand was wrapped around hers, holding it tightly, Eli's hand. She followed the arm up to its owner. He was kneeling beside her, his face a mask of grim concern in the firelight, his eyes dark and intense. For a moment that stretched into eternity, she just lay there, her small hand enveloped in his, a current of warmth passing between them that had nothing to do with the fire. It was the first time they had touched for more than a fleeting, accidental moment. It felt right, frighteningly, dangerously right. Then reality crashed back in. She was on the floor. She was wrapped only in blankets. He was kneeling over her. She snatched her hand back as if burned, a small gasp escaping her lips. She pulled the blankets tighter around her, a flush of heat rising to her cheeks that had nothing to do with her returning circulation. "You were cold," Eli said, his voice low and rough. "In the grain store. You collapsed." I'm all right," she whispered, not meeting his eyes. He stood up, putting a careful distance between them. "I made some broth." The spell was broken, but the memory of it, the feeling of his hand holding hers, lingered in the air between them. a tangible thing. That night, neither of them slept. Eli lay by the fire, staring into the embers. The image of her pale, vulnerable shoulder burned into his mind, and from behind her curtain, Miriam lay awake, her body humming with a strange new awareness, her hand still tingling from his touch. The quiet space between them was no longer empty. It was now charged with a dangerous, unspoken electricity. The town of Stone Creek was small, but its capacity for malice was vast. Tongues began to wag. A handsome, dangerous-looking drifter staying with the widow. A man with no past and a woman with one she was trying desperately to escape. The story wrote itself in the minds of the townspeople, each telling more sordid than the last. Miriam felt the change on her next trip to the general store. The whispers stopped when she entered, replaced by a heavy, pointed silence. Mrs. Gable, the preacher's wife, who usually offered a thin-lipped greeting, turned her back completely to inspect a bolt of calico. Mr. Henderson, the storekeeper, who had known her since she'd arrived, no longer met her eye. He served her curtly, his face closed and hard, and she felt the sting of his judgment like a physical slap. As she left, she heard a snicker from two men loitering by the stove. The word harlot was a sibilant hiss in the quiet room. She walked home through the snow, her head held high, but her heart felt like a block of ice in her chest. Each condemning stare, each whispered word, was a stone thrown at the fragile life she had built. She was furious, ashamed, and utterly, desperately lonely. Eli saw the look on her face the moment she walked through the door. He saw the forced straightness of her back, the telltale brightness in her eyes. He didn't ask what had happened. He knew. A few days later, the supply of flour ran out. Miriam couldn't bring herself to face the town again. "I'll go," Eli said simply. "No," she said, her voice sharp. "You'll only make it worse." "It can't get much worse, can it?" he countered, his voice quiet but firm. "Let me go, Miriam." It was the first time he had used her given name without the formal ma'am attached. The word hung in the air between them, strangely intimate. She finally relented, giving him the small list and the carefully counted coins. When Eli entered the general store, the same heavy silence fell. Henderson stood behind the counter, his arms crossed. "What do you want?" he asked, his tone belligerent. Eli placed the list and the coins on the counter. "Flour, salt, coffee." Henderson looked from the list to Eli, a smirk playing on his lips. The widow sending her new man to do her errands? Eli's eyes, which had been passive, hardened into chips of flint. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't move, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. "The list, old man. Just fill the list." "We don't like her kind around here." Henderson pressed on, emboldened by the presence of other men in the store. "And we don't like your kind either. A drifter shacking up with a—" He didn't get to finish the sentence. Eli's hand shot out, not in a strike, but to rest, almost casually, on the counter. Yet there was a coiled tension in his shoulders, a promise of swift, brutal violence in his stillness that was more terrifying than any shout. The store fell utterly silent. Then Eli spoke, his voice low, clear, and carrying to every corner of the room. It was the first time he had volunteered more than a handful of words in public, and they were not the words anyone expected. "I live at her house," he said, his gaze locked on Henderson. He let the words sink in before he continued. "Not because she needs me, because I need her." He pushed the coins across the counter. "Now, the flour." Stunned into submission, Henderson wordlessly filled the order. Eli took the sack and left without another word, the men in the store parting to let him pass as if he were a phantom. When he got back to the cabin, Miriam was waiting, her whole body taut with anxiety. He set the supplies on the table. "What happened?" she demanded. "What did they say?" "Nothing that matters," he said, turning away to hang his coat. but she wouldn't let it go.
Eli, what did you do?
I told them the truth. The story, of course, reached her later that week, a twisted version delivered with sanctimonious relish by Mrs. Gable, who had been in the store. Miriam was mortified. She was enraged. That night, after Caleb was asleep, the storm that had been brewing between them finally broke. "How could you?" she hissed, her voice a furious whisper. "How could you say that, in front of everyone?" "Say what? The truth?" he shot back, his own temper flaring. "That a woman showed me kindness when no one else would, that I needed a roof over my head? You made it sound like something else. You shamed me. I have a son. I have a reputation to think of." "What reputation?" he scoffed, the sound bitter. "The one they gave you? The one that lets them look down on you so they can feel better about their own miserable lives? To hell with their reputation. To hell with all of them." "It's easy for you to say," she cried, tears of frustration and anger shining in her eyes. "You can just leave, right away and never look back. This is my home, my son's home. I have to live with their judgment every single day. You had no right to interfere. You had no right to speak for me." "I wasn't speaking for you. I was speaking for me," he roared, taking a step towards her, his voice finally breaking its bonds of control. "For the first time in 10 years, I've found a place that's warm, a place where I can sleep without one eye open, and I won't have some dried-up, mean-spirited town take that away. Not from me, and not from you." They stood inches apart, chests heaving, the air crackling with their anger and pain and all the things they hadn't said for weeks. Her face was tilted up to his, her eyes blazing with defiance and a deep, wounded pride. His face was a thundercloud of frustration and a raw, protective instinct he didn't even know he possessed. And then, in the furious, ringing silence, it happened. He moved first, his head dipped down, and his mouth covered hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was hard, desperate, and angry. It was a kiss born of frustration and loneliness and the sudden, shocking realization of a need that ran far deeper than food or shelter. It was all the arguments they couldn't win, all the words they couldn't say, poured into one raw, bruising moment. For a second, she was stiff, her hands coming up to push against his chest. But then, something inside her shattered. The fight, the shame, the years of touch-starved loneliness, it all broke apart. A sob caught in her throat, and she kissed him back. Her hands, which had been pushing him away, curled into the rough fabric of his shirt, clinging to him. Her response was just as desperate, just as hungry, a release of a longing she hadn't dared to name. It ended as abruptly as it began. He pulled back, his breathing ragged. They stared at each other, stunned and breathless. In the flickering firelight, the anger was gone, replaced by a raw, terrifying vulnerability. The kiss had changed everything. It had torn down the last wall between them, and now they were left standing in the ruins, with nothing left to hide behind. The kiss was a brand, a searing mark left on the quiet air of the cabin. It changed the very substance of the silence that followed. Before, the silence had been a space between two lonely people, a thing of caution and distance. Now, it was a humming, vibrant thing, charged with the memory of that desperate, angry, and achingly tender collision. They moved through the next day in a fog of awareness, their orbits skewed. A simple passing in the narrow space between the table and the hearth became a moment of acute tension. When their hands brushed as he took a cup of coffee from her, a jolt passed between them, as real and potent as a lightning strike. They could no longer retreat into the comfortable roles of the taciturn handyman and the grateful widow. The lie of that simple arrangement had been burned away. They were a man and a woman, and something raw and real had been acknowledged in the firelight. The anger that had precipitated the kiss had vanished, leaving behind a terrifying vulnerability. They had seen a glimpse of the desperate hunger in each other's souls, and now they had to live with that knowledge, walking carefully around it as if it were a deep, dark well that had opened in the cabin floor. The confessions began, as they had to, with her. It was 2 nights later, the wind once again scraping at the corners of the house. Caleb was asleep, his breathing a soft, steady rhythm in the quiet. Eli was cleaning a piece of horsetack he was mending for the sheer purpose of having something to do with his hands. His head bent, his face shadowed. Miriam sat across the hearth, darning one of Caleb's thin socks, her needle moving in and out of the wool with a jerky, uneven motion. Finally, she set the sock down in her lap. "You must wonder," she began, her voice so low he almost didn't hear it over the wind, "why they are the way they are. The people in town." Eli stopped his work, but he didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on the piece of leather in his hands. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "It's not my business." "But you made it your business," she said, a faint tremor in her voice. "When you stood up for me, you deserve to know what it is you were defending." He remained silent, a statue in the flickering light. His stillness was an invitation, a quiet granting of permission. She took a deep, shuddering breath. "Thomas, my husband, he was a logger, back in the mountains. He was strong. Eli, he thought he was invincible. All the men did. They'd go up in the spring and come back down before the first snow. One autumn, he just didn't come back. A falling tree. They said it was over in an instant. They brought him down on a wagon. There wasn't much left to bury." She paused, her hands twisting in her lap. The needle fell to the floor with a tiny, unheard clink. "We had nothing saved. He always thought there would be more time. I had Caleb, barely 2 years old. The winter came, and the food ran out. I begged for credit at Henderson's store, but he refused. A widow's debt is a bad bet. He said the other women in town, Mrs. Gable, they offered prayers, but not a scrap of bread." Her voice grew hard, brittle. "Prayers don't fill a child's belly." She finally looked up, her gaze meeting his across the fire. Her eyes were dark pools of memory and shame. There was only one place in town a woman on her own could earn money quickly. The saloon. It was a filthy place, full of rough men from the mining camps. I started working there, just serving drinks. At first, mopping the floors. But the owner, a man named Silas, he expected more. The men expected more." She faltered, her voice catching. "A woman alone, serving whiskey. They see you as part of the purchase. I had to endure their looks, their words. I had to smile when they touched my arm. I did what I had to do to get the coins to buy flour and salted pork for my son. I did it for a whole winter, and this town has never, ever let me forget it. To them, I am not a widow who saved her child. I am the woman who worked in the saloon. The stain never washes off." The story ended. She sat there, exposed, her shame a palpable thing in the small room. She expected him to look away in disgust, to shift uncomfortably, to offer pity, or worse, to stand up and walk out the door, his debt to her now paid in full by this ugly truth. But Eli did none of those things. He simply looked at her, his expression unchanged. He had seen the world. He knew its casual cruelties, the impossible choices it forced upon people. He didn't see a stain. He saw a survivor. He saw a mother who had walked through fire for her child. After a long moment, he gave a single, slow nod. It was a gesture of understanding, of absolute, unqualified acceptance. It was more than anyone in Stone Creek had ever given her. A single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek, and she quickly wiped it away. A few nights after that, the moon was high and bright, casting a stark, blue-white light over the snow-covered world. The cabin was bathed in its spectral glow. It was late, and the fire had burned down to a bed of pulsing orange coals. It was Eli's turn. He was standing by the window, looking out at the vast, silent landscape. He had been standing there for a long time, so still he might have been carved from the shadows. "I killed a man," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. The words dropped into the quiet room like stones. Miriam, who had been about to bank the fire for the night, froze. She turned to look at him, his silhouette framed against the moonlit snow. "It was in a town in Kansas," he went on, his voice a dead monotone, as if he were reciting a story about someone else. "A cattle town, full of dust and whiskey and men looking for a reason to prove themselves. I was young, full of fire and too much cheap liquor. There was an argument over a card game. Stupid, meaningless. He was bigger than me, louder. He pushed me. I pushed back. It moved outside." He ran a hand over his face, the gesture weary, ancient. "I don't remember all of it, just flashes, the shouting, the taste of blood in my mouth. I had a knife. I don't even remember pulling it, but I remember the feeling of it. Going in, the surprise on his face. He just looked down, and then he fell. There was so much blood on the dusty ground." He turned from the window, and for the first time, she saw the full weight of the guilt he carried. It was in the lines around his eyes, in the deep-set exhaustion of his gaze. "I was drunk. It wasn't a fair fight. It wasn't self-defense. It was just a stupid, drunken brawl that ended with a dead man on the ground. His brother was the sheriff. I ran. I've been running ever since. For 10 years. Every time I settle in a place for more than a few weeks, I feel the past breathing down my neck. Every stranger on a fast horse could be a lawman, a bounty hunter. I can't stay. I can't build anything. I don't deserve to." He looked at her, his eyes full of a bleak, bottomless self-loathing. "That's who you let into your home. Miriam, not a cowboy, a killer, a coward who ran." Now it was her turn to be silent. She saw the truth of his life laid bare. The rootlessness, the silence, the walls he built around himself. They weren't just the habits of a loner. They were the cage of a fugitive. He was a man haunted not by the law, but by his own conscience. They were the same, she realized, both branded by their pasts, both convinced they were unworthy of peace, of love, of a simple, quiet life. She walked towards him slowly, her bare feet silent on the cold wooden floorboards. She stopped in front of him, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. He stood rigid, waiting for the verdict, for the fear and revulsion to dawn in her eyes. But she didn't recoil. Instead, she slowly raised her hand and laid it flat against the center of his chest, over the rough wool of his shirt. His whole body went taut at her touch. Beneath her palm, she could feel the strong, steady, terrified thud of his heart. She looked up into his haunted eyes, her own gray eyes clear and serious in the moonlight. "There's a heart in here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's still beating." It was an absolution. It was a recognition. It was a statement that the man who stood before her was not just the sum of his worst moment. He was alive. He was warm. He was human. Something inside Eli broke. A decade of running, of solitude, of iron-willed control, shattered into 1,000 pieces at her touch, at her words. A sound that was half-groan, half-sob escaped his throat, and his arms came around her, pulling her against him with a desperate force, as if he were a drowning man clinging to a piece of driftwood. He buried his face in her hair, and she held him, her small hands stroking his back, holding the pieces of him together. He led her to the corner of the room, to her small bed behind the flour-sack curtain. The moonlight streamed through a crack in the wall, painting a single silver stripe across the simple straw-stuffed mattress. There were no more words. Words were useless now. Their coming together was a slow, trembling discovery. It was a conversation spoken in the language of skin and breath and quiet, desperate sighs. It was every lonely night on the trail, every moment of shame in the saloon, every suppressed tear and every silent scream of a soul in exile. It was a raw, primal hunger born of years of starvation. but it was tempered with a reverence, a slowness, a profound and shaking tenderness. His large, rough hands, which knew only the feel of rope and leather and cold steel, were hesitant on her skin, as if he were touching something sacred and was terrified he might break it. Her touch, in return, was one of acceptance, her hands tracing the hard lines of his back, the old scars, forgiving it all. In the quiet of the small, moonlit room, surrounded by the vast, frozen wilderness, they found a sanctuary in each other's arms. It was not a fiery, passionate claiming, but a quiet, mutual surrender. They moved together with an instinct that was as old as the mountains, two halves of a single, broken thing finding their way back together. It was a slow, deliberate act of healing, a claiming of a right they both thought they had forfeited forever, the right to be touched, to be held, to be seen, to be loved. In the days that followed, a quiet, fragile peace settled over the cabin. They lived as if in a secret world of their own, cocooned by the deep snow and the silence of the winter. They were like a husband and wife, but their union was a secret they kept from the world, and sometimes, even from themselves. The change was in the small things, the way he would reach for her hand as they sat by the fire, the way she would put a cup of coffee by his place at the table before he even woke up, the way he would come in from the cold and his eyes would find her first. Always. He moved his blankets from the hearth to the floor beside her bed. The curtain remained, a flimsy symbol of a propriety that no longer existed between them. But the knowledge of his presence just a few feet away was a profound comfort to her through the long, dark nights. He taught Caleb how to whittle a piece of wood into a bird. He repaired the leaky roof over her bed. He hunted, bringing back a small deer that would see them through the rest of the winter. He was providing. He was protecting. He was staying. But their stolen happiness was a candle flickering in a strong wind. They were constantly aware of the world outside, of Stone Creek and the judgment that lay waiting there. They knew this peace was fragile, temporary. Eli would still find himself scanning the horizon, his body tensing at the sight of a distant rider. Miriam would still flinch at the sound of a knock at the door. They were hiding, and they both knew it. The outside world arrived on a Tuesday, in the middle of a cold, bright afternoon. It came without warning. Eli was outside, splitting the last of the logs from the sack he'd carried for her on that first day. Caleb was with him, diligently stacking the split wood into a neat pile. Miriam was inside, humming softly as she rolled out dough for that night's bread. A profound, simple domesticity had settled over them. For a few precious weeks, they had allowed themselves to believe it could last. The man on the horse was not from Stone Creek. He was dressed in city clothes, a dark wool coat and a bowler hat, things that looked out of place against the stark white landscape. He rode a fine, strong-looking bay, and he sat in the saddle with an air of purpose. He didn't approach the cabin from the road but came across the open field, his horse's hooves making soft, plowing sounds in the deep snow. Eli saw him first. He stopped mid-swing, the axe held in his hand. Every muscle in his body went rigid. The old instinct, the one that had kept him alive for 10 years, screamed a silent alarm. "Caleb," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Go inside, now." The boy, sensing the sudden, dangerous shift in the air, didn't argue. He scrambled towards the cabin. The rider reined in his horse about 20 feet from Eli. He was a man in his 40s, with a neat brown beard and cold, intelligent eyes. He looked from Eli to the cabin, then back to Eli. "You're a hard man to find, friend," the rider said, his voice calm, conversational. "Name's Marcus Thorne. I've come all the way from Denver." Eli didn't answer. He didn't move. He just stood there, the axe held loosely at his side, his mind racing. Denver? It was too far. It had to be a mistake. "I'm looking for a man." Thorne continued, swinging down from his horse with a fluid motion. Goes by a few names, but the one I'm interested in is Elias Cole. Wanted for the killing of one Jacob Vance in Prosperity, Kansas, 10 years ago. The name, his true name, hit Eli like a physical blow. He hadn't heard it spoken aloud in a decade. Just then, the cabin door opened. Miriam stepped out, wiping her floury hands on her apron, a worried question on her face. Caleb clung to her skirts. Peering out from behind her, Thorne's eyes flicked to Miriam and the boy, and a small, satisfied smile touched his lips. "Looks like you finally stopped running," he said to Eli. "Found yourself a reason to stay put. That's how we always find you boys in the end." Eli's world narrowed to a single point. He had to protect them. He let the axe drop into the snow. He raised his hands slowly, showing they were empty. "This doesn't concern them," he said, his voice a low growl. "Your business is with me." "That's right," Thorne said agreeably. But his eyes never left Miriam. What happened next was a blur of brutal, efficient violence. As Eli took a step forward, Thorne moved with startling speed. He didn't draw the pistol on his hip. Instead, he swung a heavy, leather-wrapped sap from inside his coat, catching Eli squarely on the side of the head. Eli crumpled to the ground without a sound, a dark stain spreading in the white snow beside his head. "Eli!" Miriam's scream was a raw, tearing sound. Before she could move, Thorne was on Eli, kneeling on his back, expertly binding his hands behind him with a pair of iron manacles. Caleb let out a terrified wail and buried his face in his mother's dress. Miriam's shock turned to a white-hot, primal rage. She flew from the porch, her only thought to get to Eli, to claw this man off him. Thorne stood up, turning to face her, and drew his pistol, leveling it at her chest. She stopped dead, her breath catching in her throat. "That's far enough, ma'am," Thorne said, his voice still calm, but now with an edge of steel. "I don't get paid extra for killing witnesses, but I will if I have to." Tears streamed down her face, freezing on her cheeks. She was helpless, utterly, completely helpless. Then, her eyes darted to the side. Thomas's old shotgun was leaning just inside the cabin door, where she always kept it, loaded for wolves. With a desperate cry, she lunged back into the cabin, grabbing the heavy weapon. She burst back out onto the porch, raising it to her shoulder. It was heavy, unwieldy in her small hands. She pointed it at Thorne, her whole body shaking so violently she could barely keep the barrel steady. "Let him go!" she sobbed, the words choked and barely intelligible. "Get away from him and let him go." Thorne looked at her, at the shaking gun, at the tears of terror and fury in her eyes. He didn't look worried. He simply shook his head with something like pity. "You're not going to use that," he said softly. And he was right. Her finger was on the trigger, but she couldn't pull it. She couldn't bring herself to take a life, not even to save the man she loved. The gun wavered, its weight too much for her. Her strength, her resolve, it all collapsed. With a cry of utter despair, she let the shotgun fall from her trembling hands, clattering onto the wooden porch. Her brief, hopeless rebellion was over. The fragile world they had built together had just been kicked into dust. The world went silent. The bounty hunter, Thorne, hauled Eli to his feet. Eli's head was bleeding, but he was conscious, his eyes dazed but already finding Miriam's, filled with a terrible, helpless apology. Thorne tied Eli's feet, then effortlessly threw him over the saddle of his own horse like a sack of grain. He moved with a practiced, detached efficiency that was more chilling than any cruelty. "He'll stand trial in Denver," Thorne said to the empty space where Miriam stood, not looking at her. "The circuit judge is there. They'll see he hangs before the spring thaw." He gathered the reins of his horse and, without a backward glance, began leading it away, walking back across the field the way he had come. Miriam watched them go, a small, frozen figure on the porch. She watched as Eli's dark, still form grew smaller and smaller against the vast, indifferent white of the snow. She watched until they were just a speck on the horizon. And then she watched until the speck was gone, swallowed by the curve of the earth. Only then did she move. She sank to her knees on the cold wood of the porch, a dry, ragged sob tearing from her throat, a sound with no tears to accompany it. Caleb, who had been hiding inside the door, crept out and wrapped his small arms around her neck. He was crying, but she couldn't. The cold that had almost taken her in the grain store had returned, but this time it was inside her, a block of ice where her heart had been. The cabin was no longer a home. It was a wooden box filled with ghosts. Every corner held a memory of him. The newly repaired barn wall stood as a monument to his strength. The neatly stacked firewood was a testament to his care. The small whittled bird on Caleb's bedside table was a relic of his gentleness. The silence he had brought with him had been a quiet, watchful thing. The silence he left behind was a screaming, hollow void. The days that followed were a gray, featureless blur. Miriam moved through her chores like a sleepwalker. She cooked, she cleaned, she tended the fire, her body performing the familiar tasks while her mind was 1,000 miles away, in a cold cell in a city she had never seen. Caleb grew quiet, his childish chatter replaced by a watchful, worried silence. He knew the warmth had gone out of their world. The farm, which for a few short months had felt like a fortress of fragile happiness, had reverted to what it had always been, a lonely, struggling outpost on the edge of a harsh and unforgiving world. About a month after he was taken, a rider stopped at the cabin. He was a mail courier, a wiry man with a frost-nipped face, his route a lonely line connecting the scattered, isolated pockets of civilization. He handed her a single, folded piece of paper, stained and creased from its journey in his saddlebag. "From Denver," he said, and rode on. She took it inside, her hands trembling. She did not recognize the handwriting. It was a rough, angular scrawl, the letters formed with difficulty. She sat at the small table, the same table where they had shared their first silent meal, and unfolded it. "Miriam, I am sorry. I write it, but the word is not big enough. I brought this trouble to your door. I knew I was a fool to stay. A man like me is a storm that passes through, and I should have kept walking. But it was warm in your house. I had not been warm in 10 years. I never thought to find a home. I did not think I was a man who deserved one. You and the boy, you were a kindness I did not earn. When I am gone, do not let the town say a bad word against you on my account. You did nothing but save a man's life. Tell Caleb the stories I told him were true, the ones about the wild. I do not know how to end this. I am not a man for words. I just wanted you to know that the winter I spent in your house was the only part of my life that was real. Eli." She read the letter 3 times, her vision blurring until the words swam together. The block of ice inside her cracked. The tears finally came, hot and silent, dripping onto the cheap, rough paper, smudging the ink of his name. This letter wasn't a goodbye. It was a testament. It was proof that the world she had lost had been real, and it was a world worth fighting for. The grief that had paralyzed her burned away, leaving behind the hard, cold steel of resolve. She would not let his life end in a cold, anonymous noose. She would not let the only kindness she had ever known be erased from the world without a fight. Her decision was made in the quiet of that night. The next morning, she walked into Stone Creek, leading her only milk cow. She went straight to Henderson's general store. She didn't bargain. She sold the cow, along with Thomas's good set of logging tools and a silver locket that had belonged to her mother, for less than half their worth. Henderson counted out the coins with a smug, silent satisfaction. She endured it, her face a mask of stone. The money was enough for a decent horse, enough for the journey. She found a woman on the far side of town, a poor homesteader's wife with too many children of her own, and paid her a few precious dollars to look after Caleb for a week. The parting was the hardest thing she had ever done. She knelt in the snow and held her son, his small body racked with sobs.
I have to go help Mr. Eli.
She whispered into his hair.
I will be back. I promise you, Caleb. I will come back for you.
She rode out of Stone Creek the next morning before dawn. A small, determined figure on a sway-backed gelding, heading east toward a city she knew only by name. The journey was a penance. A biting wind blew relentlessly from the north, and the landscape was a vast, unending canvas of white and gray. The world felt immense and empty, and she felt impossibly small and alone within it. But Eli's letter was tucked safely inside her coat, resting against her heart, a small, secret fire that kept the cold at bay. Denver was a shock, a chaotic explosion of noise and people and mud. After days of silent prairie, the clamor of the city was a physical assault. The buildings were impossibly tall, casting long shadows over streets crowded with wagons, horses, and a rushing river of strangers who never met her eye. She felt like a ghost, a small, insignificant creature from another world. She found the courthouse, a severe-looking stone building that seemed to suck all the light and warmth from the sky. Inside, the air was stale, smelling of oiled wood, wet wool, and old paper. Men in dark suits bustled through the halls with an air of self-importance, their voices echoing on the marble floors. She was directed to a clerk, a weaselly man with a green eye shade, who looked at her worn dress and travel-stained face with open disdain. After an eternity of waiting on a hard wooden bench, she was finally granted an audience with the man who held Eli's life in his hands, Circuit Judge Sterling. He received her in his chambers, a dark, wood-paneled room lined with thick books that seemed to absorb all sound. He was an imposing man, with a full beard of iron gray and eyes like chips of granite set deep beneath bushy brows. He sat behind a massive oak desk, a fortress of law and order, and gestured for her to stand before him. She told her story. Her voice, small and trembling at first, grew stronger as she spoke. She didn't make excuses for Eli's past. She told the truth as she knew it. She spoke of a man lost and alone, a man who had shown up at her door in a blizzard. She told of his kindness to her son, of the hard, honest work he had done to repair her falling-down farm. She spoke of his quiet dignity, of the goodness she had seen in him, the man he was now, not the drunken boy he had been 10 years ago. She spoke of his confession to her, of the guilt that had been his only companion for a decade.
He has paid for his crime every day for 10 years, Your Honor,
she finished, her hands clasped before her, her voice ringing with a desperate sincerity.
He is not the same man. He has earned a second chance. I am begging you. I am begging you for mercy.
Judge Sterling listened, his face impassive, his fingers steepled before him. When she was done, a heavy silence filled the room. He stared at her for a long, cold moment, his granite eyes passing judgment not just on her plea, but on her very soul.
Mrs.
he began, his voice a low, gravelly rumble.
You say this man, this Elias Cole, has been living at your homestead.
In your home? Yes, Your Honor. He was working for his board.
I see,
the judge said, his tone dripping with condescension. And you are a widow, are you not? Alone, with a young son? Yes, sir. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. And you come before me, into a chamber of the law, to plead for the life of a confessed killer, a fugitive from justice, with whom you have been cohabiting. You speak of his goodness, his dignity. Tell me, madam, what dignity is there in a widow who takes a strange man, a vagrant and an outlaw, into her home and her bed? What honor are you asking me to recognize, his or your own? The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. The color drained from her face. He hadn't just denied her plea. He had stripped her bare, invalidated her story, and branded her with the same hot iron of shame as the people of Stone Creek. He saw not a woman fighting for a man's redemption, but a harlot pleading for her lover. The law is clear, madam, he concluded, his voice like the fall of a headsman's axe. "Elias Cole will hang for the murder of Jacob Vance. Your testimony changes nothing. Now get out of my office." The journey home was a descent into hell. The hope that had sustained her was gone, replaced by a cold, black despair. She rode numbly, unaware of the biting wind, of the passing hours. The judge's words echoed in her mind. A cruel, relentless litany of her failure and her shame. She was 2 days out from Stone Creek, riding through a sparsely wooded section of trail, when her world collapsed completely. She had taken a little-used shortcut, desperate to get back to Caleb, to the only thing she had left. They appeared from the trees, 2 of them. They were grimy, bearded men, prospectors by the look of their gear, their eyes holding the mean, hollow look of men for whom fortune had not panned out. They blocked the trail, one grabbing her horse's bridle. "Well now, what have we here?" the first one said, his voice greasy, his eyes raking over her. "A pretty little thing, all alone in the woods." "Lost, darling?" the second one asked with a yellow-toothed grin. "Maybe we can help you find your way." Miriam's blood ran cold. "Let me pass," she said, her voice tight with fear. "Not so fast," the first one said, reaching up and grabbing her arm, his grip like a vice. "A woman like you, riding alone. You must be in a certain line of work. We got coin. We'll pay." They thought she was a prostitute. The judge's shame, given form, the ultimate, final degradation. A wave of nausea and terror washed over her. "You're mistaken," she stammered, trying to pull her arm free. "Please, I have a son." Her plea only seemed to amuse them. The first one began to drag her from the horse. She fought, kicking and struggling, but he was too strong. He threw her to the ground, into the cold, dirty snow. The world became a terrifying blur of leering faces, foul breath, and rough, tearing hands. She felt her dress rip, felt the cold snow on her skin. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the indifferent woods. As the first man pinned her down, her mind, flooded with a primal, animal terror, went strangely clear. She was not just fighting for her life. She was fighting for Caleb. She would not be broken. She would not be defiled. She would get back to her son. Her hand, flailing in the snow, scrabbled at the small reticule tied to her waist. Her fingers closed around something hard and sharp, the small folding knife Thomas had given her years ago to peel apples and cut twine. Her thumb found the notch and flicked the blade open. With a strength born of sheer, desperate will, she bucked, arching her back, and drove the small blade upwards with all her might. She felt a sickening soft resistance, then a jarring connection with bone. The man above her grunted, a sound of pained surprise. He stiffened, his eyes going wide. He looked down, as if confused, at the handle of the little knife protruding from just below his ribs. He made a gurgling sound and collapsed on top of her, a dead, crushing weight. The second man, who had been holding her legs, stared in horror. He scrambled back, his eyes wide with shock and fear, looking from his dead companion to the wild-eyed woman struggling out from under the body. He saw the blood. He saw the look on her face, not of a victim, but of something far more dangerous. With a terrified cry, he turned and fled, crashing through the underbrush like a panicked deer. Miriam lay in the snow, trembling violently, her breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. She was covered in mud. Her dress was torn, and she was spattered with the blood of the man she had just killed. The body lay beside her, its eyes open and staring at the gray sky. A wave of revulsion and horror washed over her, and she retched into the snow. She had taken a life, the final, terrible stain. The news, when she finally staggered back to Stone Creek, was a garbled, vicious thing. The surviving attacker had made it to a nearby mining camp, babbling a story of a wild woman, a backwoods harlot who had lured them in, tried to rob them, and then murdered his partner when they refused her price. By the time the story reached town, Miriam wasn't a woman who had defended herself. She was a murderer. The town's judgment, which had been a thing of whispers and cold shoulders, now became an open, baying mob. They saw her not as a grieving mother, but as a contagion of violence and sin. Eli's crime had tainted her, and now she had brought a fresh killing to their doorstep. She was dangerous, unclean, Mrs. Gable led the charge, her face a mask of righteous fury, demanding the sheriff run the killer whore out of town before she brought ruin down on them all. Miriam found herself a prisoner in her own home, the glares of her neighbors more solid than any prison bars. The story traveled, as all dark news does, carried by couriers and gossips and freight wagon drivers. It traveled all the way to the Denver jail. A guard, a cruel-eyed man who enjoyed his small measure of power, was the one who told Eli. He read a lurid account from a Denver newspaper, savoring every word. The so-called widow of Stone Creek, paramour of the fugitive Elias Cole, has now followed in her lover's footsteps. The guard read with a sneer. Stabbed a man to death in the woods. They say it was a deal for services that went sour. They're calling for her to be run out of the territory, if not hanged herself. Eli heard the words, but his mind refused to process them. Miriam? A killer? It was impossible. He grabbed the bars of his cell, his knuckles white. It's a lie, he rasped. Is it? The guard laughed. Like attracts like. Cole, you're both murderers. A perfect match. When the guard left, Eli began to pace his small cell like a caged wolf. The guard's words, the newspaper's lies, they painted a picture that his mind twisted into a horrific, vivid nightmare. He imagined Miriam, alone, desperate, being driven to some terrible act, and he knew, with a certainty that was like a blade in his gut, that it was his fault. He had brought this on her. He had left her alone and unprotected. His past hadn't just destroyed him. It was now destroying the only good thing he had ever known. The helplessness was a poison. It was worse than any beating, worse than the thought of the noose. He was locked in this cage while the world tore her apart. Rage, pure and black, consumed him. He roared, a sound of pure, animalistic agony, and slammed his fists against the stone walls until his knuckles were raw and bleeding. And then, through the red mist of his rage, a single, terrible clarity emerged. There was one thing he had left to give, one final act. The next morning, he told the guards he needed to speak to the warden. He had a proposition for the judge. He was ready to make a full and public confession. He would give them every detail of the killing in Kansas. He would plead guilty to any and all charges. He would forfeit any right to an appeal. He would walk to the gallows without a fight. He had only one condition. He wanted to testify, under oath, at any hearing or trial concerning the actions of Miriam Thatcher. He would accept his own death, welcome it even, if it meant he could stand before the world one last time and tell them the truth about the woman he loved. A man's offer to trade his life for another's is not a currency the law typically accepts, but in the stark, frozen landscape of the West, where survival often depended on such desperate bargains. Eli's proposition was an event. It was an anomaly that piqued the interest of Judge Sterling, a man who, for all his rigid adherence to the letter of the law, possessed a grudging respect for a bold play. A hearing was set. It was not a trial for Miriam, but an inquiry into the circumstances surrounding the death of the prospector, and the star witness, brought in chains from the city jail, was to be the condemned killer, Elias Cole. Miriam was summoned to the same courthouse, the same cold, imposing building that had been the site of her humiliation. She sat on the same hard wooden bench, but this time she was not a petitioner. She was a key figure in a drama she didn't understand, her heart a cold, tight knot of dread and a fragile, terrifying hope. She watched as they brought him in. He was thinner, his face paler from weeks without sun, but the gauntness only sharpened the hard lines of his jaw and cheekbones. He was clean-shaven, and the loss of his beard made him look both younger and harsher. He wore simple prison-issue clothes, but he walked with his head held high, his shackles clinking with each deliberate step. His eyes scanned the small, crowded courtroom, passing over the hostile faces from Stone Creek, over the impassive clerks. And then they found her. In that brief, silent exchange, he conveyed everything, his sorrow, his resolve, and a deep, unwavering love that was as solid and real as the stone walls around them. He was sworn in, his hand steady on the Bible. Judge Sterling presided, his face an unreadable mask of granite. A prosecutor, a thin man with a reedy voice, began the questioning, establishing the facts of Eli's own case, painting him as a violent drifter, a man whose word was worth nothing. Eli answered the questions calmly, his voice a low, steady rumble that filled the silent room. Yes, his name was Elias Cole. Yes, he had killed a man named Jacob Vance in Kansas. Yes, he had been a fugitive for 10 years. He conceded every point, giving the prosecutor no ground for a fight. Then, the prosecutor turned to the matter at hand. And this woman, Miriam Thatcher, you lived in her home. Is it not true that your influence, the influence of a killer, led her to her own violent act? No, Eli said, his voice ringing with absolute certainty. You're saying a decent, God-fearing widow would, of her own accord, stab a man to death in the woods? I'm saying a decent woman will do whatever it takes to protect herself, Eli countered, his eyes flashing. And I'm saying you don't know the first thing about her. Judge Sterling leaned forward. Mr. Cole, you made an unusual offer to this court. You offered to expedite your own execution in exchange for this testimony. The court is curious. What is it you believe you can tell us that would have any bearing on this matter, or your own? This was his moment. Eli turned his gaze from the prosecutor and fixed it on the judge. He was no longer a witness being questioned. He was a man delivering a final testament. You think you know who I am, Your Honor, he began, his voice quiet, but carrying an immense weight. You see a drifter, a drunk, a killer, and you're not wrong. I did kill Jacob Vance. I put a knife in him and I watched him die. For 10 years, I've let the world believe it was over a card game, that it was a drunken brawl. I let myself believe it too. It was easier than remembering the truth. A hush fell over the courtroom. Even the prosecutor seemed momentarily stunned into silence. But that's not what happened, Eli continued, his voice dropping lower, pulling everyone in. Jacob Vance was the son of the wealthiest rancher in that county. He was a man who believed the world belonged to him, and everyone in it. I had a sister. Her name was Sarah. She was 17 years old, and she was gentle. She loved books and wildflowers, and she wouldn't have harmed a fly. He paused, and for the first time, a flicker of raw, unbearable pain crossed his face. He swallowed hard before continuing. Vance decided he wanted her. He cornered her one evening on her way back from the church. He was drunk, and he was with his friends. Eli's voice broke for a fraction of a second, and he clenched his manacled hands. They held her down. They tore her dress. They laughed. They didn't complete the act, because the parson came along and scared them off. But they broke something in her that day, something far more precious than her body. They took her voice. She never spoke another word above a whisper after that. She wouldn't leave the house. The light just went out of her. Miriam gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She was seeing him now, not as the hardened drifter, but as a young man watching his sister's soul die. I went to the sheriff, Eli said, his voice now laced with a decade of cold fury. He just laughed, said it was a misunderstanding, said Sarah was a flighty girl and that Jacob Vance was a fine young man who'd had a little too much to drink. He told me to go home and forget about it. But I couldn't forget. I saw what Vance did every time I looked at my sister's empty eyes. A few nights later, I found him in the saloon. I wasn't there to play cards. I was there for him. I told him he had to make it right, to go to my father and apologize, to clear my sister's name. He just laughed in my face. He called her a whore. He said he'd be back to finish what he started. And then he pushed me. So I pushed back, and when he drew a knife, I drew mine faster. I didn't kill him in a drunken rage. Your Honor, I killed him because he was a monster who was never going to face justice. I killed him for my sister, Sarah, and I'd do it again." He stood straight, his confession and his justification hanging in the dead silent air. He had recast his own narrative. He was no longer a common killer. He was an avenger. "And now," he said, his eyes finding Miriam's, "you have a woman here who did the same damn thing. She found herself alone in the woods, with two men who saw her as a thing to be used. They attacked her. They tried to break her, but they were wrong, because she is the strongest person I have ever known. She fought back. She survived. You want to call that murder? Then you have to call what I did murder, with no excuse. But if you have an ounce of justice in you, you'll call it what it is. You'll call it a woman refusing to be a victim. You'll call it self-defense." He fell silent. He had said all he had to say. He had laid his own soul bare to save hers. The courtroom was utterly still, the weight of his words pressing down on everyone. Judge Sterling stared at Eli, his expression unreadable, but the granite in his eyes seemed to have softened. Just a fraction. He looked from Eli's defiant face to Miriam's tear-streaked one. He saw the connection between them, the terrible, beautiful truth of their story. He banged his gavel once, the sound like a gunshot in the silent room. "This inquiry is concluded," he announced. "The court will render its judgment." The judgment, when it came an hour later, was a miracle. The charges against Miriam Thatcher were dismissed. The judge ruled that she had acted justifiably in the defense of her own life against a violent assault. She was free. As for Elias Cole, the judge was uncharacteristically lenient, while acknowledging that vigilante justice could not be condoned. The extreme provocation and the 10 years Cole had already spent as a fugitive were taken into account. His charge was reduced from murder to manslaughter. His sentence was not death, but 5 years of hard labor. With the possibility of parole in 3, it was not freedom, but it was life. It was a future. They allowed them a moment together in the cold, empty hallway outside the courtroom. The guards stood a respectful distance away. For a long minute, they just looked at each other, unable to speak. The relief so overwhelming it was a physical force. Snow had begun to fall outside, thick, soft flakes drifting past the tall windows. Then Miriam was in his arms, her face buried in his chest, her body shaking with silent sobs. He held her tightly, his chained hands resting on her back, his face pressed into her hair. He was real, he was warm, he was alive. "They're taking me to the territorial prison at Cannon City," he murmured into her hair. 3 years, Miriam, maybe less." 3 years, she whispered, the number an impossible chasm and a miraculous gift all at once. She pulled back to look at him, her hands framing his face. "Eli," he silenced her with a finger to her lips. "You saved my life." "No," she whispered back, tears tracking through the dust on her cheeks. "We saved each other." She looked out the window at the falling snow, the same snow that had brought him to her. It seemed like a lifetime ago. "If we only have this winter," she began, her voice thick with emotion. "If we only have today before they take you, then let's live it like it's forever." He did not go back with her. The law, though merciful, was still the law. The guards took him away that same afternoon. But the world had changed. The future, which had been a locked door, now stood slightly ajar. Miriam returned to Stone Creek not in shame, but in triumph. The news of the judge's decision had preceded her, and it had shattered the town's smug certainty. They saw her now not as a fallen woman, but as a survivor, a woman who had faced down predators in the woods and the cold judgment of the law and had won. The stares she received were no longer of contempt, but of a grudging, fearful respect. The silence was no longer a weapon used against her. It was a space she commanded. But her victory was hollow without him. The cabin was still empty, the silence still profound. The 3 years of his sentence stretched before her like a barren desert. But now she had a reason to cross it. She had his letter, and she had the judge's verdict, and she had the memory of his arms around her. She had hope, a small, tough, resilient thing. She set about reclaiming her life with a fierce energy. She worked the small farm, her hands growing calloused, her body strong. She cared for Caleb, who, now that the immediate terror had passed, slowly began to find his voice again. She lived a quiet, solitary life, holding herself apart from the town, waiting. And then, just as the second winter of his absence was beginning to release its grip, another miracle occurred. A territorial amnesty, granted by a new governor, reduced the sentences for nonviolent offenders and those, like Eli, convicted of lesser crimes under extenuating circumstances. His 5-year sentence was commuted to time served. He arrived back at the farm one evening in early spring. Just as the sun was setting, he was walking, just as he had been the first time she saw him. He was thinner, harder, but his eyes were clear, and they were fixed on her. She was on the porch, splitting kindling, and she looked up and saw him, a dark figure walking out of the purple twilight. She dropped the axe and simply stared, her heart stopping in her chest. He stopped a few feet from her, his face uncertain, as if he feared he might be a dream she would reject. "Miriam," he said, his voice rusty, but it was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. She didn't run to him. She walked, slowly, deliberately, as if crossing a sacred space. She stopped in front of him and laid a hand on his chest, just as she had done that night in the moonlight. She felt the strong, steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. It was real. He was home. The days that followed were a quiet, sacred time of rebuilding. He fell back into the rhythm of the farm as if he had never left. But this time, he was not a temporary handyman working for his board. He was a partner. He finished rebuilding the barn, making it stronger than before. He tilled her small, fallow field, preparing it for a spring planting. He hunted, and the smell of roasting venison once again filled the small cabin. He set about building a new room onto the side of the house. It was a slow, laborious process. He felled the trees himself, squared the logs by hand. It was to be a proper bedroom, with a real window and a wooden floor. It was a statement, a declaration of permanence. He was not just staying for the winter. He was building a life. One evening, they sat at the table for dinner. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm, golden glow on their faces. A savory stew simmered in the pot. The 3 of them were together. Eli, Miriam, and Caleb. They were a family. The sight was so simple, so ordinary, and yet so profoundly beautiful, it made Miriam's heart ache with gratitude. Eli was telling Caleb a story, not of lonely coyotes or wild mustangs, but of a man who crossed a great desert to find his way home. Caleb listened, his chin in his hands, his eyes wide with wonder, and then he laughed. A pure, clear sound that filled the cabin with light. Miriam looked at Eli, and he looked at her, and in that shared glance, all the pain and loneliness of the past years dissolved. There was only the warm, gentle peace of the present. That night, she came to him in the new room. It was not yet finished. The walls were still bare logs, and the cold spring air slipped through the cracks. But a fire burned in a small stove he had installed in the corner, and the moonlight streamed through the empty window frame. They came together not with the desperate, hungry urgency of their first time, but with the slow, deep, certain knowledge of 2 souls who had fought their way back to each other. There were no more secrets, no more shame, no more fear. There was only the warm firelight on their skin, the whisper of their breath in the quiet, the profound, healing language of a love that had been tested by distance and despair and had emerged, not just intact, but stronger. It was a gentle, reverent act, a silent vow, a homecoming of the flesh as well as the spirit. The next morning, Caleb woke early. He padded out of his small room and saw them standing by the hearth, watching the fire. They were holding hands. His mother was leaning her head on Eli's shoulder, and Eli was looking down at her, a small, gentle smile on his face. The cabin was filled with the quiet, warm light of a new day. Caleb looked at them, at the way their hands were clasped together, a perfect, unbroken circle, and for the first time in a very long time, he smiled. Spring did not arrive all at once. It came in whispers and suggestions, a slow, tentative softening at the edges of the world. It was in the sound of water dripping from the eaves, a sound they hadn't heard in months. It was in the smell of damp earth emerging from its white shroud. It was in the changing quality of the light, a pale gold that held the first faint promise of warmth. And as the land began its slow, grudging thaw, so too did the frozen heart of Stone Creek. The change wasn't spoken. It was a thing of actions. It began with Mr. Henderson at the general store. When Miriam went in for supplies, he met her eye for the first time since before Eli's arrest. As he tallied her purchases, he cleared his throat and, without a word, added a small paper sack of horehound candy to her pile. "For the boy," he mumbled, his gaze fixed on a shelf behind her. It was a small gesture, but it was an apology, an offering of peace, and it was as loud to Miriam's ears as a peal of church bells. A week later, 2 men, farmers from the east side of the valley, rode up to the cabin. They were men who had watched her in silence for months, their faces closed and judgmental. They dismounted, carrying hammers and a bundle of fresh-cut cedar shingles. "Heard your roof took a beating this winter," one of them said gruffly, not looking at her but at the patched, sagging section over the main room. "Can't have a boy sleeping under a leaky roof." Before Miriam or Eli could respond, they had a ladder against the wall and were on the roof, the rhythmic sound of their hammers echoing in the clean spring air. They worked all day, speaking little, and refused her offer of payment, accepting only a hot meal and a cup of coffee before riding off into the twilight. They had not come out of friendship, not yet, but out of a grudging respect forged in the crucible of her and Eli's trial. They had endured, they had fought, they had returned. In the unwritten code of the West, these things mattered more than past gossip. They had proven they were not a blight upon the town, but a part of it, forged from the same hard land and iron will. The most profound reconciliation, however, arrived on the back of a tired-looking gray mare. The rider was an old man, his back stooped with age, but his eyes, a startlingly familiar shade of blue, were clear and alert. He was dressed in the simple black coat of a traveling preacher. He dismounted stiffly and stood for a long moment, just looking at the cabin, at the new room built onto its side, at Eli, who had frozen mid-stride on his way back from the stream, 2 buckets of water in his hands. "Elias," the old man said, his voice a reedy quaver, but carrying the unmistakable cadence of a man used to speaking from a pulpit. Eli slowly set the buckets down. The color had drained from his face. "Father," he said, the words sounding foreign and stiff on his tongue. The old man, Reverend Josiah Cole, took a hesitant step forward. "Your letter. It found its way to me. It took a long time." He looked past his son to where Miriam now stood in the doorway, her hands clutching her apron. "I had to see for myself. I had to see the woman who finally made my son stop running." The meeting was fraught with the tension of a decade of unspoken words, of a father's grief and a son's shame. Miriam invited him in, and they sat at the small table, an awkward trinity in the quiet cabin. Josiah Cole was a man of God, but he was also a father who had lost one child to violence and another to exile. He looked at his son, truly looked at him, and saw not the wild, angry boy who had fled into the night, but a man, tempered and quieted by hardship, his eyes holding a depth of sorrow and a newfound peace that the Reverend had prayed for but never expected to witness. He reached into his coat and pulled out a sealed envelope, its edges worn soft with travel. He slid it across the table to Eli. "This came to me about a month ago," he said. "It's from the Vance family." Eli stared at the letter as if it were a coiled snake. He made no move to touch it. His father continued softly. "Jacob's mother wrote it. Her husband, the sheriff. He passed on 2 years back. She's alone now. She heard the story, the real story, that came out of your trial. She wanted you to have this." With trembling fingers, Eli broke the seal. Miriam watched his face as he read, watched the tight lines of guilt and anger that had been etched there for a decade slowly, miraculously, begin to smooth. He read the letter aloud, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't hide. It was not a letter of forgiveness, for that was not the mother's to give. It was a letter of truth. She wrote of her son's arrogance, of his cruelty, of the darkness that had been in him. She wrote that she had known about Sarah, had been ashamed, but had been silenced by a powerful, prideful husband. She did not absolve Eli of his crime, but she acknowledged the terrible wrong that had precipitated it. The letter ended with a single, devastating line: "I pray God has mercy on both our sons, for the world had none." The letter was a release. It was the closing of a wound that had festered in Eli's soul for 10 years. It did not make what he did right, but it set the story straight. It lifted the crushing weight of being the sole villain in his own narrative. He looked up from the letter, his eyes bright with unshed tears, and met his father's gaze. The chasm of a decade closed in that look. "She saved me, Father," Eli said, his voice raw, looking at Miriam. "In more ways than one." Reverend Cole turned his gentle, tired eyes to Miriam. "He was a good boy who made a terrible mistake," he said softly, "and he ran from his own goodness for a long, long time. Thank you, my child, for showing him the way home." The past was not erased, but it was finally laid to rest. Miriam's own ghost was laid to rest a week later. On a trip to town, a new establishment had opened. A small but clean and proper diner. A place where families could eat without the smoke and rough talk of the saloon. As she walked past, a woman called her name. It was Martha, a woman who had worked alongside her during that terrible winter at the saloon. A quiet, weary girl who had disappeared from Stone Creek a few years back. But this was a new Martha. She was confident, her face fuller, her eyes bright. She was the owner of the new diner. They embraced, a shared, unspoken acknowledgement of the past they had survived. "I heard what happened, Miriam," Martha said, her voice warm with genuine admiration. "All of it. You're the strongest woman I've ever known." She gestured to the bustling interior of her new diner. "I need help. I remember your cooking. Even with the slop we had to work with back then, you could make it taste like something. I need a head cook, someone I can trust, someone who knows what hard work is. The job is yours, if you want it." The offer was more than a job. It was a restoration of her dignity. Head cook. It was a title of respect, a recognition of her skill, completely separate from the shame of the place where she had been forced to learn it. It reframed her past, not as a source of disgrace, but as a crucible that had forged her strength. She thought of the long years ahead, of providing for Caleb, of building a real future with Eli. "I'll think on it, Martha," she said, a slow, genuine smile spreading across her face for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. "Thank you." She walked away not as the widow from the saloon, but as Miriam Thatcher, a woman with a future, a woman with choices. Life settled into a new, beautiful rhythm. Eli did not give up his horse or the saddle. Some part of him would always be the man who had lived under the wide-open sky, several days a week. He rode out, sometimes hiring on for a few days at a time at a nearby ranch, checking fence lines or helping with the spring branding. He was a cowboy still, but the rootlessness was gone. He was no longer drifting. His rides had a purpose and, more importantly, a destination. Every evening, without fail, the lone rider would appear on the horizon, and every evening, he would return home. He would return to the smell of baking bread, to the sight of Miriam on the porch, to the sound of Caleb running to greet him. The stories he told the boy by the fire were different now. They were still about the wild, but now they were also about finding your way, about the importance of a home camp, about the North Star that could always guide you back. After Caleb was asleep, he would go to their new room, to the bed he had built with his own hands, and lie beside Miriam, his body fitting against hers as if they were carved from the same piece of wood. He was a man who had found his North Star. One evening, a soft spring rain was falling, a gentle, cleansing patter on the new cedar roof. The air smelled of wet earth and new leaves. Caleb was asleep. Miriam was standing at the dry sink by the kitchen window, humming softly as she washed the last of the dinner dishes. The cabin was filled with a deep, quiet peace. Eli came to stand behind her. He didn't speak for a long moment, just rested his hands on her shoulders, his presence a warm, solid comfort at her back. She leaned into his touch, closing her eyes. "Miriam," he said, his voice a low rumble against her ear. She turned, wiping her damp hands on her apron. He was looking at her with an intensity, a tender gravity that made her heart beat a little faster. He took her hand and led her to the center of the room, to the open space before the hearth. And then he knelt. He knelt on one knee on the worn wooden floorboards of the home they had built together. His head bowed for a moment before he looked up at her, his eyes shining in the firelight. He held out his hand. Lying in his palm was not a ring of gold or silver. It was a simple, dark circle of iron. He had forged it himself in the small fire of the blacksmith's shop, taking a single, common iron nail, heating it until it glowed red hot, and then patiently, painstakingly, bending and hammering it into a perfect, unbroken circle. It was rough, imperfect, and the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. "I don't have anything precious," he said, his voice thick with a lifetime of unspoken emotion. "No silver, no land to speak of. All I have is what you see, a man with a long shadow behind him." He took a breath, his gaze holding hers. "But you and Caleb, you are the only reason for me to stop wandering. You're the end of the trail for me. Miriam, will you have me? Will you be my wife?" Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the firelight, blurring the face of the man kneeling before her. She could not speak. The words were too small for the emotion that filled her entire being. So she simply nodded, a slow, deliberate lowering and raising of her head. Yes, 1,000 times. Yes. He slid the simple iron ring onto her finger. It was still warm from his hand, a perfect, solid fit. He stood and pulled her into his arms, and the kiss they shared was not one of desperation or hunger, but of a deep, abiding peace. It was a promise made in the quiet of a rainy spring night, a promise of forevers. The story ends, as all good stories should, with a new beginning. It ends a few weeks later, on a bright, warm morning. The last of the winter snows had finally receded, leaving behind a world washed clean, green and vibrant with new life. The three of them, Eli, Miriam, and Caleb, stood together on the porch of their small, sturdy home. Miriam's hand was in Eli's, the dark iron ring a permanent, solid weight on her finger. Eli's other hand rested on Caleb's shoulder. They stood in silence, watching the last, stubborn patch of snow in the shade of the barn finally surrender, melting away into the dark, rich earth. And as it disappeared, the first true rays of the morning sun broke over the distant mountains. warm and brilliant, pouring over the land and touching their faces. It was a light that didn't just illuminate, it penetrated, chasing away the last of the shadows, filling their hearts with the simple, profound warmth of a love that had not only survived the winter, but had been born from it. Thank you for listening to this story around our campfire. We'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below and let's connect. If you enjoyed our tale, consider subscribing to the Wild West Campfire channel for more stories from the heart of the Old West, and feel free to share your thoughts.